for however long it will take. Now, I suspect that it's something I'm not upset about this. I didn't say, hey, you have to mow the lawn. This isn't like a directive. I just said, I promise I will pay you $10 if you will mow the lawn. So the lawn isn't mowed, but if it happens, I will make good on my promise. And that will occur. It's contingent on her behavior. I've made a promise. I mean that promise. I will make good on that promise. I will do what I say, but it's contingent. She has to engage. She has to respond. If she doesn't respond, I'm not just going to dole out $10 and pretend that the lawn was mowed. I say, no, this is the reality. You mow the lawn. Here is the result. Now, when that occurs out in time somewhere, if it doesn't though, there's no money, right? I promise that I will do this, but there's no money. Now she can extend this out further and say, well, now that I don't have the money, I can't put gas in my car. And because I can't get gas in my car, I can't go to school. Or I can't do this or this thing. And so we can begin to see how things start to unravel, right? This is connected to this, and this is connected to this, and this is connected to this. So she comes back and she says, well, Dad, it's your fault that things are going wrong, right? Because as a result of me not having this and now this has happened and this has happened and this has happened, kind of moving on down the line and saying, well, this is your fault that this particular thing has occurred. Can she say legitimately that because this negative event has taken place, that I am punishing her? That in some way we can make this leap that says that I've made these particular promises. If this negative thing occurs, well, then it must be his fault. Now think about how we often do this with God. In other words, there are promises that are made in which there's a contingent reality to them. What he's saying is that our response, the human response, is contingent on that promise being fulfilled. He's not saying that he won't do it. He's just saying this is the reality of my relationship with you. And so, as we draw off the resources of what God is saying that he promised that he would do. So he promises to forgive if you ask. But if you do not ask, you do not have. There's a contingency here. Will he keep his promise? Absolutely he will. Does he promise to give you peace? Does he promise to give you joy? Does he promise to engage in your life in such a way to make you more than conquerors? That's the language of Scripture. Does he promise these things? You bet he does. But there's a contingency to that. And for us to make these particular conclusions that in some way, somehow he's punishing us as a result, no. If we don't have a peace because we haven't drawn off of what God promises, in other words, if we're ill-equipped to carry these things out in culture, right, within the lives of the people around us, if we're ill-equipped to do this, then yes, there are negative things which are going to occur. But that doesn't equal God saying, well, I'm punishing you because you didn't take advantage of the promises. I don't think that's legitimate thinking. I don't think that's a fair process of what is happening as God is making promises to jump to those particular conclusions. We have not engaged in what God said that he is willing and promises to do. But because we are ill-equipped, the negative consequences or the negative effects that come from us being ill-equipped as a result of those particular things, we can't turn to God and say, well, this is your fault. That you have done this, that you are punishing me. I wasn't taking this approach of saying, well, I'm going to punish you here, and I'm going to punish you here, and I'm going to punish you here. God is saying there are consequences that are connected. There are things that are occurring. Now, do those particular things occur outside of his observance, his control, his sovereignty? Absolutely not. Because we're going to go back to this idea. When God swore and gave an oath, he looked around and there was no one greater. It's not as though anything is happening outside of God's control, but in his interaction with us, there are promises that he makes to us all the time that are contingent on our action. And that we can bring things to pass by engaging on these. And also our passivity can also bring things to pass depending on what occurs. You might think, well, boy, that really sounds like you're just kind of rolling the dice. Like, no, we're always doing that in the context of a God who is sovereign. That's good because that means that ultimately in the end, right, you're not God. Your decisions can't move and control everything. But it's not to say that in somehow, some way, that if we're not experiencing God's promises, as in some of the examples that I read, if we're not receiving those particular benefits, then a lot of it has to do with our engagement. A lot of it has to do with our choice. A lot of it has to do with our movement. God is saying, I promise. God is saying, I will do this. God is saying that I will engage. And that's why there's a constant call. Come and follow. Come and believe. Come and wrestle. Come and trust. See, there's always an alternative in this, in the process of engaging God. There's always something else that we can engage. There's always something else that we can move towards. Let me give this example. Marriage engagement. All right, the promise to be married. All right, think about this. All right, when you ask somebody to marry you, you are in essence making a promise. You're saying, someday out in the future, I promise to stand up and take vows and marry you. And so you enter into this, into this promise. And so when I asked my wife to marry me, we went, we were in Clearwater at the time, and I went down to the channel side, and I had this place where we would, be alone. We were out by the water, and I thought it was kind of romantic. It was there, and I expressed my love for her, and I got down on my knee, and I asked her to marry me, and right, we made this promise, and so when we went back to college, right, she had a ring, and he's made a promise. Here's we're not married. I promised to do this. I promised to do this thing out in the future. Now, what's interesting about this is that when I said, in essence, I gave this promise, I didn't also say to Jennifer when I asked her to marry me, I didn't say, well, I promise to marry you if you don't cheat on me, if you don't lie, and if you don't murder someone, and if you don't rob a bank, right? I mean, do I have to, in other words, in making that particular promise, do I have to list everything that would, in essence, make that promise null? Right? I mean, I'm just saying, I've made this particular promise, but there is no one in this room, right, that would come to the conclusion that that promise cannot be overturned. That there are particular behaviors so that if Jennifer decides to murder someone or rob a bank or whatever, they'd say, hey, look, I totally get it. She's a bank robber. Marriage probably isn't a good thing. Right? And even though you were engaged, and even though you made this promise, so there's a contingency here. There's a contingency that's within this promise. There's so many assumptions that are being made about this promise, and if this promise is legitimate. Now in our life, we make all sorts of promises, and we can't spend the time today about talking. I mean, there are some side discussions here and talking about the promises that we make. I think sometimes there's promises that are unwise, that are evil, and even the promises that we make, the results would bring about an evil outcome. And to think in terms of promises that are laid out in such a way as though they supersede good and evil and morality is foolish thinking. But as we're engaging God, all the time there are promises, and you'll find this in the Old Testament, there are things that God will say, and He promises that He will do them. Take Nineveh, for example. Jonah walks into Nineveh, city is going to be destroyed. Gone. Going to happen. God said it. Nineveh said, then the king of Nineveh says, everyone fasts. Not just everyone's going to fast, even the animals are going to fast. You're going to make your cat fast, and your dog fast, and your cattle fast. Everyone's going to fast. And they repented, and God said, I won't do it. God said to David after he committed the sin with Bathsheba, I'm going to take the life of your newborn son. And David prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed, and the servants didn't really understand. God said this. Why are you engaging God? Why are you asking? And David said, well, the child is alive. If I continue to pray, maybe God won't do this. There's something about God that David believed something about God, his interaction with God, he believed that there was a contingency on this. Not that God that we're incapable of nailing him down, or that we can't really be sure, or we're not. No, he's always good in his promises. His promises are never lead to evil, never founded on evil, never ever directed towards darkness in any way. But there are so many things in our interactions with God. There's contingency. And in our process of working out our salvation with God, God is saying, come and engage. If you don't engage, then don't be upset when you're ill-equipped. I promise you that if you come and you engage in life with me, that you will find rest and you will find peace. I promise that if you engage, you will find wisdom. But we have to say, well, what if we don't? Should God just give this to us? Is that what promising makes? So when it comes to salvation, then what security do we have? And this is where it begins to lead. And this is why it's very important to understand why the covenants play such an important role, and why the writer of Hebrews is invoking the covenants of God. Because of what is happening, what is going on in our hearts as well. And the process of taking oaths and the process of taking vows is something that we do as well. And matter of fact, it affects our lives in the same way, as far as God is calling us, that we can make decisions about where we place our vows or what we swear oaths to. And we go through this process all of the time. And this is where sin becomes a very important part of the equation, in which we are determining where are these areas in our lives in which we are making promises to things. In other words, we in essence are making oaths to things, that we are giving our lives to things. A lot of people make oaths to money, processes to money. I will devote my life to you. In essence, that's what they're saying. If you return me independence, if you return me power, if you return me freedom, if you return me security. We make oaths and promises to romance. Right? Offer, you supply me with this, you give me this, I'll give my life to you. I'll surrender my life to you. I'll give my life over to you. We make oaths to good things. We promise even to good things. I'll dedicate my whole life to my family. And we expect, and we're looking for a return. If you return to me love, support, success, insulation from the world, security, a feeling of doing something good, of giving my life over to something. We give our lives to causes. Some people devote their whole life to things that are good, that are worthy. We give oaths and promises to these things. We swear to these things. But in the process, what the Bible is saying is that in so doing, you must reject. In other words, you're choosing a higher authority. That even when God entered into an oath, he recognized that there was a necessity for a higher authority, but there wasn't one. He was it, and he swore by his own name. And so we function within the same framework of needing a higher authority. In other words, we're always appealing to a higher authority. There's something in your life that is a higher authority in which you appeal to, that you swear by, that you believe, that you stake your life on. It's an oath that you're making. In essence, it might not be something that is done ceremonially, but in the process of rejecting God as a higher authority means that somewhere along the way you are putting something in the place. If not you, if it's not you, the one who's doing it directly. By rejecting God, you're saying the higher authority is me. I will be the one who will determine. I will be the one who, and so we swear. Often we don't realize that we're swearing oaths unto ourselves. We are using ourselves as the authority by which to establish and rationalize our behavior, to establish that it's valid and good and right. And we're the authority to determine so. You live your life your way, I'll live my life my way. Right? As long as your life doesn't affect my life, and my life doesn't affect your life, what I'm doing, then we're all good. There's all sorts of language that feeds this type of thinking. But it's why we feel so betrayed when the return that we're looking for doesn't pan out. And it's not uncommon for somebody to say, I've devoted my whole life to my children, and this is how I'm treated. I've devoted my whole life to the poor. I've devoted my whole life to helping people. I've devoted my whole life to family. I've devoted my whole life to bettering society. And you can say, these are good things. But why are we so angry and so frustrated and so... Whatever it might be that we fill in the blank, we've made oaths to these things. We've made promises to these things. And we're saying in the future, somewhere along the way, right? This thing should support me, give me what I need, give me foundation. We're ultimately looking for salvation. That's what we're searching for. That's what we're searching for. And so in the promises of God, is He's saying, yes, all of these things I promise, come and get them. Come and get them. But there's a huge glaring problem. And the huge glaring problem is that even though the promises exist, and even though they're contingent, in other words, we can tap those resources and experience peace and rest, there is still something that is so incredibly wrong with us that we are powerless to overcome. And this is where the covenants become so important. And this is why, this is why this passage of Scripture and other like them are so important, to providing you with the security to know and to believe that what God says that He will do, He will bring to pass. Amen. Now think about this. Going back to that illustration about, when I was talking about promising, asking my wife to marry me and making that particular promise in a future date, right? We'll stand up and make vows. Now, the process of taking those vows, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, right? It ups the ante. You're standing up now, and you're making vows, and you're making promises and vows and oaths. Right? And we know the traditional, right? In sickness and health, till death do us part, blah, 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 right? Okay? Now, what if the promise, though, before we're married, I promise, I say, okay, I promise to marry you, but before that happens, and I promise I'll do this, right? As long as between the time that we get married and you never lie to yourself, to me, to another human being, or to God. That you never spend your money on anything frivolous, and you never let your gas in your car drop below 3/4 of a tank. Those are the stipulations. Now you can add a whole bunch more onto it. But anyone who is saying that, you say, well, there's a point at which, nobody can keep that. Nobody can do that. Right? Even if you make those particular promises, even if you're willing to do this, you can't. She's not going to be able to do that. Right? At some point, right, that tank is going to drop below 3/4 of it. I know it. Right? I know it. There's a point at which she's going to lie to someone, to herself, to another person, to God. It's going to happen. Right? It's absolutely going to happen. There's no possible way that she could keep those stipulations. There's no way. And so you look at the promises that God is making, and you're saying, well, I couldn't even possibly achieve those anyway. What good is the promise? Because even if they do exist, and even if it's contingent on me, in other words, I can pursue them and go after them and get those particular promises, I can never really honestly in all fullness come to a point of salvation and know, because when we really look at the promises and what's contingent on them, that perfection of life, the rules that I just gave about, that God has 1,000 more perfect living in every single way. Like, what's the point? Sure, He promises, but I could never get that far. I could never make it. I could never do it. And this is why He invokes the story of Abraham. Because in the story of Abraham, we find this covenant, and this is why the covenant's important. Because this is a point at which it changes. See, those promises that God is making, yes, there's a contingency to them, but when it comes to his covenants, he swears by himself. And this is where you need to put your rest. This is where your life, where you're staking your whole life on these particular things. Because what God is doing is he's saying, as it concerns salvation, that I swear no matter what. In other words, it's not contingent on you in any way, shape, or form, that I will bring salvation to pass in your life. I will do it. Not contingent. I will do this thing. That God has swears by his name that he will bring this to pass, that all of his purposes will come to pass. And so we can rest in our belief that when we put our faith in Christ and when we put our faith in God, that it rests on the covenant where he says, because I have sworn it, it will come to pass, it will stand, and it can never be removed. It can never be taken away. It can never be lost. It can never be rejected. It can never, it's impossible. It's impossible. So when we ask, how do we know that God really loves us? How do you know when it's true love? Right, that's a question. Like, there's this song from this Disney, it's one of these live action like Disney musicals, and where people are just dancing around, life that's not really real, where dancing breaks out in a park and all of a sudden everybody's choreographed perfectly, And there's this song, how do you know? How do you know if it's real? How do you know, right? How do you know if he really loves you? How do you know? Every time you pass by any magazine, like Cosmopolitan, anything, there's always that